Alright, we're running. You can start where you're ready.
Well, since our last meeting, I've done some writing. And I thought it might be a good idea to start this one out by saying the history of Desoto probably should start with the history of the Methodist Church, because they were here long before there was a Desoto. And well, I've got a couple of paragraphs on the Indian treaties and how and when Delaware County was finally, by treaty, taken from the Indians, and then settlers finally started moving in to buy the government land. And then we'll start with the church history. The first church, they met in a farm family's log cabin, started in 1837. And met there for 12 years till 1849, when they bought a little piece of land, half acre, and built a little frame church. And this was right across the street from where the Union Cemetery is now. There's a little history in that cemetery. It was started by one of the Pittenger family. There was many of them. A big family of Pittengers came here from Ohio. And the father of the clan lived here about 2 years and died. And so they buried him on a high piece of ground that belonged to, it was part of the farm that belonged to his son. And they continued burying family and neighbors there, babies, on this 3/4 of an acre. And finally, when the church located over there, the church bought that 3/4 of an acre, and later on added an acre to it, and then later than that they added another 3 acres, and the church, or the cemetery, is still functioning, still burying people. And this Nicholas Pittenger, the old man of the Pittenger family, his stone evidently was a good one, because you can still read it. He was the first one buried there, and he died August the 30th, 1839. He's the oldest burial in the cemetery. And another historical point of the cemetery is at the end of the Civil War, a Confederate soldier in uniform come walking through Desoto, or what was part of Desoto then, and he didn't know who he was, didn't know where he lived, didn't know anything. And so the people here found him a place to sleep, and he made enough money to get by on, working for farmers, building fence, digging ditches, helping harvest crops. He lived about 3 years, and he died. And so they buried him down in the old cemetery. I had heard this story, and being one of the trustees of that cemetery, I saw an old chart where there was an X marked on it down in the old part, and it said, "Under this tree is buried a Confederate soldier." There was no stone. So about 5 or 6 years ago, the trustees of the cemetery decided that they would put up a stone for him. So we secured a big granite rock out of the Mississinawa River, and dug a base and put it where his grave was, and then had a local stone cutter come down and engrave that stone. And the stone merely says Confederate soldier. known but to God. But every year when we put flags out on Memorial Day on the veterans, he gets a flag, and the next day there's also a Confederate flag on there. Someone puts it on. It's quite all right. But as a veteran, he's honored just the same as the other 58 veterans in that cemetery. But the church controlled that cemetery, but there was always a committee of volunteers that took care of it, and still is. I have been for, I don't know, probably 30 years. But now I've got my son on that committee, so we're going to keep it running. Then start with this first church that they built. It was a frame building on this half acre across the street from the cemetery. And people met there for, well, from 1849 when they built it until 1870 when they needed a bigger church. So they decided to build a bigger church right beside the old one. And this one would be built out of brick. Well, they, right there on the half acre, they dug up clay dirt and fired the bricks right there on the property and built this brick church. And both of these first churches had two front doors, one for the men and one for the women. And in the sanctuary of the church was a center aisle, went down the middle, and the women sat on one side of the aisle and the men on the other. This was a custom in the Methodist Church for many, many years. The brick church, in 1932, a group of the people in this church decided that they needed a bigger church, and they wanted it near the village, which was Desoto, which was half mile down the street. There was, at this point, there was buildings in Desoto and some businesses. And the trustees of the church met and decided that if this group could raise $16,000 in 5-year pledges in the next 6 months, they would give them the okay to start construction of the new church.